to obey you, to embrace the truth, to treat others fairly, and to avoid speaking harshly. Lord, give them such respect for one another that they will assume the best motives for the actions of their colleagues. Help our senators to remember that you are the judge of the universe, who sees everything, whether good or bad. Lord, you can even see the motivations of our hearts. Inspire us all to permit our thoughts, words, and actions to be acceptable to you. And Lord, we respect the conclusions of the Electoral College and ask you to bless President-elect Joseph Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Will you please join me in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Senator from Iowa.
1 minute for morning business, please.
Without objection.
We're probably all guilty of not remembering the sacrifices of our men and women in uniform, but particularly during this time of year, it is especially difficult for them to be away from friends and family. Right now, there are almost 1,500 Iowans deployed overseas with the Iowa National Guard, just as one example of a group we should be thinking about. And I think about this group because that 1,500 includes one member of my own staff. We rely on our brave men and women in uniform to protect our way of life, our democracy, and the liberties we cherish. The sacrifices they make are not taken for granted and won't be forgotten by future generations. All of our nation's service members and their families will be in my prayer, and I hope the prayers of all of my colleagues during this holiday season. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
Over the last 4 years, our country has benefited from a presidential term filled with major accomplishments. President Donald Trump has repeatedly surprised the skeptics, confounded his critics, and delivered significant policy victories that have strengthened our country. Case in point, back in May, when the president set the goal of finding a pandemic-ending vaccine by the end of this year, his timeline was literally dismissed by people who assumed they knew better. Here was one quote: "Trump promises coronavirus vaccine by the end of the year," scoffed one headline, but his own experts temper expectations. Fact check complained, another headline: "Coronavirus could come this year," Trump says. Experts say needs a miracle to be right, end quote. Well, with the genius of science, support from Congress, and the bold leadership of the Trump administration, that medical miracle arrived right on schedule. Americans on the front lines are receiving vaccinations as we speak. This episode offers a kind of microcosm of the last 4 years on so many subjects, from economic prosperity to foreign policy to protecting American families, the skeptics doubted him. The critics derided him. But President Trump has delivered. When President Trump ran for office, he promised to help open a new chapter for working families. After 8 years of failed policies that concentrated wealth and optimism among the lucky few, prosperity was going to flow to all kinds of workers in all kinds of communities, he said. And that's exactly what happened. Before this pandemic spread from China and the world had to slam on the brakes, the American people had the best job market in living memory. With help from the policies of President Trump and Republicans in Congress, American workers dynamited the stagnation that experts had said was the new normal. Unemployment hit a 50-year low. Capital markets hit record highs. And this time, all kinds of Americans got to share in the gains. We saw earnings grow faster for workers than for managers, faster for the bottom 25 than for the top 25. This success was fueled in part by the policy leadership of President Trump. This administration pursued bold regulatory changes. Once-in-a-generation tax reform had eluded prior leaders. This president signed it into law in his first year. And together we repealed the worst part of Obamacare. The unfair individual mandate was zeroed out. President Trump also took historic steps to strengthen the future of our trade with the world. He secured the historic United States-Mexico-Canada agreement and the bilateral tax treaties with partners in Europe and in Asia. A nation this productive needs plenty of energy to keep it going. Fortunately, President Trump and his administration ended the ideological war on fossil fuels and hit the accelerator on all of the above American energy dominance. In the last 4 years, we surpassed Saudi Arabia in oil production. We saw energy exports exceed energy imports for the first year in almost 70 years. Meanwhile, we saw CO2 emissions fall, along with other harmful pollutants. That energy independence has dramatically strengthened our hand with respect to the rest of the world, particularly the Middle East. So speaking of the Middle East, President Trump wasted little time pulling back from the prior administration's disastrous Iran deal. His team eliminated daylight between us and Israel and repaired our relationships with Arab partners. And he aligned these relationships around our common shared interests, countering threats like radical Islamic terrorists and Iranian aggression. Under President Trump's command, our forces took terrorist leaders like al-Baghdadi and Soleimani off the battlefield. The physical caliphate that ISIS established on the previous president's watch was destroyed. All of this paved the way for the Abraham Accords, the historic normalization of relationships between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and most recently, Morocco. And the potential is there for more on the horizon. Now, the Middle East isn't the only place where the Trump administration has shored up our footing on the world stage. Our 45th Commander-in-Chief set out to rebuild and modernize our military and to move our foreign policy from a chapter of weakness and apology into a renewed posture of strength. 4 years later, we have a new national defense strategy to complete with and deter adversaries like Russia and China. We have rebuilt the military and invested in new technologies to ensure America keeps our edge in everything from cyber to space to advanced weapon systems. And the President's leadership has not stopped with those who are currently serving. He also signed into law the historic VA Mission Act, to ensure our dedication to the men and women in uniform does not end when their tours conclude. So clearly, Madam President, the list of American accomplishments since 2016 is nearly endless. There are the many miles of new protections on our southern border. At one point, apprehensions at the border hit their lowest level since the 1970s. Essential causes like religious liberty and the most vulnerable, the unborn, have had a champion in this administration instead of an adversary. There have been historic new steps to conserve our national treasures, like the Great American Outdoors Act. And perhaps most important of all, President Trump nominated and this Senate confirmed 3 outstanding Supreme Court justices, along with more than 220 more Article III federal judges. These are brilliant, young constitutionalists, men and women in lifetime appointments who will renew the judiciary for a generation. All because President Trump knows we need judges who respect the essential but limited job description the framers wrote for our third branch of government. So as you can see, Madam President, it would take far more than one speech to catalog all the major wins the Trump administration has helped deliver for the American people. The outsider who swore he would shake up Washington and lead our country to new accomplishments, both at home and abroad, proceeded to do exactly that. President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence deserve our thanks and our gratitude for their tireless work and their essential roles in all these victories and in many more. 6 weeks ago, Americans voted in this year's general election. The legal and constitutional processes have continued to play out since then. Yesterday, electors met in all 50 states. So as of this morning, our country has officially a president-elect and a vice president-elect. Many millions of us had hoped the presidential election would yield a different result. But our system of government has processes to determine who will be sworn in on January the 20th. The Electoral College has spoken. So today I want to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden. The President-elect is no stranger to the Senate. He's devoted himself to public service for many years. I also want to congratulate the Vice President-elect, our colleague from California, Senator Harris. Beyond our differences, all Americans can take pride that our nation has a female Vice President-elect for the very first time. I look forward to finishing out the next 36 days strong with President Trump. Our nation needs us to add another bipartisan chapter to this record of achievement. I suggest the items of court.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Madam President,
Senator from Illinois.
I ask consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the judiciary, Thomas L. Kirsch II of Indiana to be United States Circuit Judge for the 7th Circuit.
Madam President,
Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, if you follow the United States Senate, which of course many of us do, there was a noteworthy moment this morning. It was actually a prayer by our chaplain, Barry Black. And in that prayer, he acknowledged and called for the blessings of God on the President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. The reason that was noteworthy is that has been a contested issue among politicians on Capitol Hill for weeks as to whether or not Joe Biden could be described as president-elect. Many had stepped forward and said yes, but many resisted. The acknowledgement by the chaplain caught me by a little surprise this morning, and I came to the floor to hear the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, go through an accounting of the Trump presidency and all of his achievements, and then conclude by acknowledging as well that we have a president-elect in Joe Biden. I believe that that reflected the reality of the November 3rd election and the finality of the Electoral College decisions being made across the nation in so many states. I thank those who have stepped forward to acknowledge the reality of the new president and hope that they will join me in an effort to do our best to make certain that his tenure is a success, not just for him personally and the vice president, but for our nation. We deserve nothing less. It's a long story, these last few weeks since November 3rd and what's happened across America. I don't think anyone could have predicted that we would see the divisive reaction that we have seen. Nor could anyone have predicted what happened yesterday. Some states had to take extraordinary measures to protect Electoral College electors. What used to be a routine, somewhat tedious and boring mission resulted in the closing of legislative buildings in Michigan to the public and, according to press reports, credible threats of violence. In Arizona, electors met in an undisclosed location to safely cast their votes. These measures followed a last-ditch effort by 17 Republican attorneys general and more than half of the House Republican caucus joining in a lawsuit and accompanying amicus brief before the Supreme Court, which incredibly argued that the court should nullify the votes of more than 20 million Americans. These ludicrous arguments couldn't hide the true justification for joining this effort to undermine our democracy. The people who were protesting simply don't like the results of the 2020 election, and they don't want to turn their backs on President Trump. The conservative-leaning Supreme Court summarily dismissed this effort outright, rejecting the lawsuit in an order on Friday evening, wasting no time in doing it. Despite repeated and forceful judicial rejections of their baseless allegations of fraud and attempts to nullify the votes of Americans, only 27 congressional Republicans would publicly acknowledge the obvious president-elect of the United States, Joe Biden, as of last week. Now that the Electoral College has spoken, more congressional Republicans are finally stepping up. But the fact that it took 6 weeks for my colleagues to recognize reality and stop undermining our democratic process is sad and disappointing. When we were sworn in as members of Congress, we took a simple oath: support, defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Foreign and domestic. It's not an oath to one person nor one president. It's not conditional if one receives enough angry phone calls. It's not dependent on whether the responsibilities are difficult. And it's certainly not optional if one has to face a more challenging electorate. And yet, with the exception of only a few in this Senate chamber, the silence in upholding this oath in the face of President Trump's blatant attempts to undermine our democracy has been overwhelming. Just compare it to the courage shown by state and local election officials across the United States, including many Republicans, who always hastened to add that they had voted for President Trump. They were disappointed in the election of Joe Biden, but the election in their state, by their measure, was honest and fair. They don't enjoy the perks and protections we have here in Congress, but they stepped up and spoke up, and I respect them for it. Proud Americans of both parties under personal threat for their integrity in defending an American election that the President of the United States once overturned. Senator Murphy, the junior senator from Connecticut, came to the floor on Friday and spoke eloquently about this threat to American democracy that has been playing out in plain sight. The blatant and shameful attempt to use the power of the presidency to overturn a free and fair election, an election which is the foundation of our democracy. Senator Murphy reminded us about the fragility of our democracy and how it should never, ever be taken for granted. And he warned about collaborating in silence as these efforts are made to destroy it. How democracies die. The poignant remarks and the outrageous actions of recent weeks reminded me of a dinner I hosted with the authors of a powerful book, How Democracies Die. The authors, Stephen Levitsky, Daniel Zablat, detail examples in which democracies are weakened, collapse, and even are destroyed. I recommend it as urgent reading to my colleagues in the Senate at this moment in our history. They highlighted the critical role of established political leaders in standing up or failing to stand up in key moments when events or persons threaten their democracies. Venezuela in the early 1990s, a key establishment party leader opportunistically sided with Hugo Chavez after a coup attempt, devastatingly giving Chavez critical legitimacy he then used to gain power and bring this country to its current state of decline. I believe we have such a moment here that demands leaders of both parties to carry out their oaths of office and defend our treasured democracy. Quite simply, silence is unacceptable. I'm glad for what Senator McConnell said this morning on the floor of the Senate. Perhaps Chaplain Black inspired him and will inspire others to step up and speak the truth. Madam President, on a separate issue, I've given a big part of my life to this institution, the Senate, and I respect what we have been able to do on many occasions. Through honest give and take and compromise, we have been able to bring legislation to this floor, to debate it, to consider amendments, to pass the legislation, and ultimately not only make a law, but change the lives of Americans. We were at that moment where we need it again. And 10 of us, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, as well as House members, decided 3 weeks ago that enough was enough. We needed to show some leadership and try to work out a compromise between us for another COVID relief package. You see, it's been 9 months since we passed what was known as the CARES Act on the floor of the Senate, 96-0. Overwhelmingly unanimous, bipartisan decision to spend about $3 trillion, not only to fight the pandemic, but to restore our economy. Thank goodness we did. It really gave us an opportunity to do something for America when it desperately needed it. We thought that the threat of the pandemic would soon ebb away, but it did not. It wasn't gone in 6 months. It isn't gone today. In fact, in some places in America, it's worse now than ever. My state of Illinois, despite the heroic efforts of my governor and many others, is suffering with infections, hospitalizations, and sadly, many, many, too many deaths. That is the reality of where we are today. And so this group of 10, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, have been meeting for 3 weeks, even on Thanksgiving Day, when we did a Zoom call, had some conversation about a phase of this that might be important for us to consider. I tell you that because we did produce a work product, and one that I think is worthy of consideration immediately on the floor of the Senate. It was an effort to reach a spending target of $908 billion to provide immediate assistance across the board in the United States, to extend unemployment benefits where they are desperately needed, to give help to businesses, some $300 billion in new lending authority, to provide additional funds for SNAP, the food stamp program, which many desperate families turn to feed their children, help to our farmers, help to the renters who are facing eviction under their leases if we did nothing, help to hospitals and nursing homes and clinics. We all know they're on the front line of this battle. Money for testing of those who suspect that they are infected with COVID-19, and more resources for the logistics of vaccinations. The CDFI program is an effort to extend lending authority, particularly in desperate communities that are battling both poverty as well as this pandemic. $5 billion for mental health, and we certainly know we need it. The psychological pressure that America is facing is obvious in so many ways. Education, over $80 billion in education. $10 billion in child care. We can't overlook the fact that many can't return to work because there's no child care that they trust with their kids. Help as well for expanding broadband. As our kids have to turn to remote learning in many places in America, broadband has to become a fact of life across this nation. $45 billion in the whole transportation system network that's been devastated by this economic downturn. $10 billion to our Postal Service. They're working harder than ever, and we want to make sure the men and women of the Postal Service who do such a remarkable job know that we have their back. Extensions of spending authority for the CARES Act are just a few of the things that we considered over the 3-week period. We came up with a bill that spends $748 billion. There were 2 items that were not included in the base consensus bill because we couldn't reach a consensus on them. State and local government assistance, I support completely. I know my cities, my counties, and what my state has gone through. They need help. We couldn't agree on including that in the package at this moment. I hope that changes even today. And finally, the issue of liability and immunity from liability. This has been one that's been raised by Senator McConnell for months. He's basically said that nothing is moving until he gets a provision, which I find objectionable, originally offered by Senator Cornyn. And here's what it comes down to. Should people be able to go to court if they believe that they have been harmed or members of their family have died as a result of the wrongdoing of people during this COVID-19 pandemic? Some argue that businesses should not have that possibility hanging over their head, and that's what Senator Cornyn used as a basis for his provisions that make it almost impossible for anyone to recover for any losses during COVID-19. Others believe that we need to show an even-handed approach to this on both sides. If we are going to be fair to businesses who are legitimately in good faith trying to protect their employees and customers, we should also leave the possibility open that those who are responsible for their actions need to be held accountable in court. I think that is a simple and basic provision, that there be equity on both sides, not just for plaintiffs, but also for defendants. We tried mightily during the last several weeks, and I want to salute my colleagues that engaged directly in that effort, Angus King of Maine and Tim Kaine of Virginia, Chris Coons of Delaware, Dick Blumenthal of Connecticut, Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire. We offered a variety of options which we thought were reasonable and served the purpose of justice, but we couldn't reach an agreement. The others on the Democratic side who were part of this overall effort deserve mention in the record. I don't want to miss anyone, but I want to include certainly Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Mark Warner of the state of Virginia, and Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire. For all of them, I thank them for bringing forth this measure, and now it's going to be in the hands of the leadership. I hope that we can call it this week. We should not go home without it. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Democratic leader.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, as the Republican leader rightly acknowledged a few moments ago, Joe Biden will be the next President of the United States, and our colleague Kamala Harris will be the next Vice President of the United States. Leader McConnell's Republican senators ought to follow suit. They ought to acknowledge that Joe Biden will be the next president and Kamala Harris will be the next vice president. And for the sake of the country, President Trump should take his cue from Leader McConnell that it's time to end his term with a modicum of grace and dignity, qualities that his predecessors took great pains to display during our grand tradition of a peaceful transfer of power. Enough is enough. Our Republican colleagues, for the sake of our democracy, for the sake of the peaceful transition of power, should stop the shenanigans, stop the misrepresentations, and acknowledge that Joe Biden will be our next president. Enough is enough. And they should follow, Republican senators and Republicans throughout the country should follow Leader McConnell's lead and acknowledge now that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. Now, on COVID-19. In a year full of grim milestones, yesterday delivered the grimmest yet. More than 300,000 Americans have now died from COVID-19, greater than the number of American soldiers who died during the entirety of World War II, a population the size of St. Louis or Pittsburgh, wiped off the map. 300,000 American souls. As trucks bearing the first shipments of frozen vaccine fan out across the nation, the first best hope for defeating the pandemic in the new year, we cannot lose sight of what we've lost this year. That is what the end of 2020 has brought. Hope tinged by grief. It was an amazing sight yesterday to see the first American inoculated against the disease, a nurse at Long Island Jewish Medical Center in Queens, my home state of New York. But for so many, the vaccine has not come soon enough. Let it be our tribute to those Americans we lost, to do everything in our power to limit the losses moving forward, to produce and distribute as many vaccines as are necessary, and encourage every American to take the vaccine when it's available to them. 3 million doses of the vaccine are already out the door, and another vaccine is already in the emergency authorization process. Still another vaccine candidate may be ready early next year. As I said yesterday, the discovery of the coronavirus vaccine in the span of a calendar year is a crowning scientific achievement of the 21st century. Our job now is to ensure that the good work of America's scientists, biochemists, and medical research is brought to bear, that given the tools, we finally stamp out COVID-19 from our country, begin the road to recovery. We need to fully fund not only production of the vaccine, but its distribution as well. The states need that money. I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President.
Majority Whip.
Is the Senate in a quorum call?
We are.
I would ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Madam President, yesterday was a hopeful day as the first COVID vaccines in the United States were distributed to healthcare workers on the front lines of the COVID battle. And later this week, the FDA will hold a meeting on an emergency use authorization for Moderna's COVID vaccine, meaning that we could have a second coronavirus vaccine authorized before Christmas. If all goes well, we expect to have 100 million Americans vaccinated by March. Madam President, that's a pretty amazing statistic when you consider that just a year ago, we didn't even know about the virus. And it's a tribute to the innovative power of the private sector and the efforts of Congress and the Trump administration to expedite vaccine development. It's been a long, hard year, but the light at the end of the tunnel is coming. But while yesterday was an encouraging day, we have more work to do on the COVID front. First, we all need to keep following the CDC's recommendations. The rollout of Pfizer's vaccine is wonderful news, but cases in the United States are still surging. Until we can get a lot more people vaccinated, we need to do everything we can to slow the spread of the virus and avoid overwhelming our hospitals. Second, we need to pass another COVID bill here in Congress to provide additional funding for vaccines and deliver other urgently needed relief to our fellow Americans. Republicans, of course, have been trying to pass additional COVID legislation literally for months, Madam President. And I'm encouraged that in the past few weeks, a number of Democrats have stepped forward to work with Republicans to develop bipartisan legislation. Just yesterday, a bipartisan group of senators released legislation along the lines of what the Majority Leader has advocated: targeted relief that focuses on our most critical needs in the areas where Republicans and Democrats agree. This includes important COVID priorities like vaccine funding, money for schools, and help for the hardest hit small businesses. Republicans and Democrats' ideal COVID bills might look very different, but there are a number of things that all of us agree need to be addressed. And we should, Madam President, in fact, we must pass legislation to take care of those priorities. I'm thinking about vaccine distribution especially. We've been blessed with not one, but two viable vaccines, with more on the horizon. We can't afford to undermine this success by failing to provide the resources that are necessary for widespread distribution. Madam President, the ball is in the Senate Democrat leader and Speaker Pelosi's court. We have bipartisan support for targeted relief to address our most critical priorities. In fact, the Democrat leader in the House noted on Sunday that, and I quote, "I think we need to get an agreement and we need to get this bill passed. Nobody ever gets everything they want, and it's critically important that we deal with these very, very important objectives, even if we don't get on either side everything that we want," end quote. That from the Democrat leader in the House of Representatives. Meanwhile, the Democrat whip on the Senate side was part of the bipartisan group that suggested dropping the most controversial aspects and focusing on those things on which we agree. So the answer, Madam President, really lies with Speaker Pelosi and the Democrat leader here in the Senate. Are they going to heed the bipartisan calls to deliver critical coronavirus funding, or are they going to continue to block relief for Americans? Madam President, around our country, Americans are struggling under the worst wave of the virus to date. They need more help, and above all, they need the vaccinations that will help bring this pandemic to an end. We can pass additional coronavirus relief legislation this week. And to quote the Majority Leader, let's get it done. Madam President, I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I'd ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, yesterday evening, President Trump shared the news that Attorney General Bill Barr will be leaving the administration in coming days. And I want to take a moment to publicly thank the Attorney General for his service to our country. Under two different presidents and at two very different times in our country's history, Bill Barr gladly answered the call to service. His steadfast leadership has enabled the Department of Justice to continue its mission at a pivotal moment in our nation's history. And I particularly appreciated Attorney General Barr's attempt to get to the bottom of some of the abuse of power by the FBI and the Department of Justice during the latter parts of the Obama administration and early in the Trump administration. During his time as Attorney General, General Barr has consistently fought to improve the safety of our communities across the country by tackling violent crime and aggressively countering transnational criminal organizations. He's been a champion of Project Safe Neighborhoods, which has strengthened community partnerships and helped reduce crime rates across our country. He's taken aim at the threats that exist beyond our borders, from drug cartels in Mexico to economic exploitation and outright theft by China. Through it all, he's been dogged in preventing injustice as in pursuing wrongdoing. So I want to thank the Attorney General once again for not only answering the call to serve a second time, but also for once again serving with distinction and integrity. Mr. President, on another matter, this week is set to be the final week for the 116th Congress, and the American people are counting on us to do our job. We have until this Friday to fund the government, and I hope we can pass legislation that provides more certainty than the stopgap bills that have become the norm in recent years. It's simply impossible for government agencies and departments like the Defense Department to plan with short-term continuing resolutions. They need longer term so they can plan and actually spend taxpayer dollars far more efficiently. This is also our final opportunity to reach an agreement on another coronavirus bill, something that's been on our to-do list since this summer. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to send a stack of bipartisan bills to the President's desk for his signature. Now, these may seem like small ball compared to some of the big issues like keeping the lights on for the government or another COVID-19 relief bill, but they are very important bipartisan pieces of legislation. One of those is the Jenna Quinn law, which I've spoken on here on the Senate floor many times. The goal of this legislation is straightforward: to stop child sexual abuse. It will help us do that by building on the success of what's now known as Jenna's Law in Texas and in other states, which requires training for teachers, caregivers, and other adults who work with children, who will receive specialized training on how to detect and report and thus prevent child sexual abuse. Signs of child sexual abuse are unique from other forms of child abuse, and correctly identifying these signs is integral to bringing children out of sexually abusive situations. Now, you might ask, if there's a Texas state law providing for this, why do we need a federal law? Well, not every state has done what Texas has done, but also they need the funding to help pay for this specialized training. That's what the Jenna Quinn law that's pending in Congress will do. And it will encourage other states without similar laws to implement innovative programs to address child sexual abuse. There should be few things more unifying than the war against child sexual abuse, which is why this bill passed the Senate unanimously earlier this year. But days have turned into weeks, and weeks have turned into months, and the House still hasn't passed the Jenna Quinn law. that's not because House members oppose the bill. If it came up on the floor today, nearly every member of the House of Representatives would vote for it. This bill hasn't been able to pass the House because one chairman, Democratic chairman, won't even give the House a chance to vote on it. For months, Education and Labor Committee Chairman Bobby Scott has refused to move the Jenna Quinn law. Despite repeated requests from countless child advocacy groups and a bipartisan group of senators and congressmen, it continues in purgatory on the committee calendar. Senator Hassan, Smith, and I sent a letter to Congressman Scott urging him to take action and allow this life-saving legislation to pass the House this year. He responded to our letter saying he'll continue to hold this legislation because he wants to add it to other more complicated legislative measures next year. So when it comes to detecting and preventing child sexual abuse, Chairman Scott thinks we can wait till next year. We can't wait till next year. In short, he admitted that this legislation is so important and so valuable, he can't let it pass on its own. It's got to drag other, more controversial, more partisan pieces of legislation along with it. And just when you think things can't get any worse, they do. As I said, this legislation will provide funding to the states, and it'll encourage states like Congressman Scott's home state of Virginia to implement them. You would think that Congressman Scott would care. If he didn't care for the bill that would benefit the rest of the country, you would think he would care about how it would benefit his constituents in his home district in Virginia. Virginia doesn't currently require this training for teachers, caregivers, and other adults who work with children, and this legislation would fix that. And making this matter even more urgent is the pandemic. Experts believe that the unique conditions created by COVID-19 have caused instances of child sexual abuse to go up, while the number of reports have gone down. Families are experiencing a range of new stressors, including everything from job losses to financial instability to health anxiety, all while isolating at home with their children. And the children who aren't going to school each day are out of sight from the teachers, the bus drivers, and other adults they would otherwise come in contact with, who are most likely to identify and report child sexual abuse. Adults who work with children are the #1 reporters of that abuse. So there could not be a more urgent need for this legislation. This is not a partisan pet project. It's legislation that will save the lives of children across the country. Victims in my home state of Texas and Congressman Scott's home state of Virginia would experience the life-saving benefits of the Jenna Quinn law. A couple of weeks ago, the Dallas Morning News published an editorial titled, "If Congress can't even pass a law to help save kids from sex abuse, what can it get right?" Well, that's a fair question and a tough but necessary question. When you see what Chairman Scott is doing, it's easy to see why Congress's approval rating is so abysmal. If a high-ranking leader, really, of a House committee will block common sense legislation that is directed at stopping child sexual abuse, how can the American people have faith in Congress's ability to accomplish anything? So, Mr. President, now is not the time to play politics or use child sexual abuse victims as leverage. This bill is one step away from going to the president's desk, and Congressman Scott is the only one standing in the way. It's time to quit playing games and allow the Jenna Quinn law to pass. Mr. President, now on one final matter. We are less than a month away from the biannual changing of the guard here in Congress before we gavel out for the year. I want to say just a few comments about our friend from Colorado who will soon be leaving the Senate, Senator Cory Gardner. Senator Gardner has proudly represented the people of Colorado for 15 years, first in the State House, then the House of Representatives, and now in the United States Senate. Once you get to know Corey, it's easy to see how this boy from Yuma became such a trusted voice for his home state. For starters, he's a prime example of what Ronald Reagan called the happy warrior. At the end of a speech in 1985, President Reagan spoke about the pursuit of high ideals like liberty, freedom, and fairness, and the reasons our country has to be hopeful and optimistic. He said, "So let us go forth with good cheer and stout hearts, happy warriors out to seize back a country and a world to freedom." Those qualities of good cheer and stout hearts could not be a more appropriate description of our friend from Colorado. Senator Gardner has maintained an understanding, has a very keen understanding of the challenges we have faced as a nation, and he channels his passion and his optimism in finding solutions to those challenges. And there's no question he does get results. In the 6 years he's been in the Senate, Corey has accomplished more than some senators have accomplished in double or maybe even triple that time. He's been a strong voice on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and has helped lead changes to counter some of the most pressing threats facing our country. He helped pass the first ever sanctions on North Korea to denuclearize one of the most untethered states and nations in the world. He's fought to hold China accountable for their gross human rights violations, specifically those targeting the Uyghur people. And he's led efforts to strengthen our relationship between the United States and Taiwan. But I think the accomplishments he's most proud of are those that hit much closer to home. Corey introduced legislation to designate 988 as a national suicide prevention and mental health hotline. It's impossible to know how many lives have been and will be saved by simply adopting this 3-digit phone number. And this last year, he led in the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, the largest conservation bill in a generation. A big factor in Corey's success has been his relationships with his fellow senators. Not those backroom transactional relationships you think of, perhaps when you think about politics, but I mean real friendships with folks throughout the Capitol complex. If there were a Mr. or a Ms. Congeniality Award in Congress, Corey would win by a landslide. It's common to see him talking not only with senators from both parties, but staffers from other offices. He was once a staffer in Senator Wayne Allard's office, so he can identify with them, as well as the Capitol Police and the countless other men and women who keep Congress running, from cafeteria workers to cleaning staff. He greets every person with the same genuine smile, and he'll gladly spend a few minutes chatting, asking about your family, holiday plans, or how someone's day is going. That sincerity, his willingness to listen and deal with people on such a human and personal level, is something we need more of, not less of, here in Washington, especially these days. So, Mr. President, the Senate will miss our happy warrior and the trademark positivity he brings to even the most contentious debates. And while we're sad to see him go, I know this isn't the last we'll hear of or see of Corey Gardner. The only thing more enduring than his energy is his drive to help people from all places and in all walks of life. So while our colleagues are sad to bid farewell to our friend Corey, we know that Jamie, Allison, Caitlin, and Thatcher are all eager to have him back home in Yuma and see more of him and spend more time together. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President,
Senator from Oregon.
would ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
President, millions and millions of people will breathe a bit easier on January 20th. That relief will be especially sweet for those who've suffered under Donald Trump's cold-hearted approach to immigration and asylum. The president has built a wall to immigrants, but it's not made of fencing or brick and mortar. The president has rebuilt the infamous paper wall like that of the 1930s that kept too many Jews out of the United States, trapping them within the murderous regime of Nazi Germany. The paper wall was built on anti-migrant regulations, including one targeting anybody who might become a so-called public charge. It was reinforced by racism, anti-Semitism, and nativism. It created bureaucratic roadblocks that had no purpose other than to frustrate applicants, block visas and refugees, and slow immigration to a trickle. That is awfully familiar to those who watched Donald Trump succeed horribly at repeating some of America's worst immigration mistakes. In the last 4 years, I've often thought about my late mom and dad, who were refugees to America. My parents were German Jews who fled the Nazis. Not all of our family got out. My great-uncle Max was one of the last to be gassed at Auschwitz. When my father arrived here at 13, he barely spoke any English. He studied hard. When the war came, my dad, who wasn't exactly built like Captain America, wanted more than anything to wear the uniform of the U.S. Army. My dad essentially talked his way into the service. He joined the Army's Psychological Warfare Division because, with his fluent German, my dad wrote propaganda pamphlets that our planes dropped on the enemy soldiers that were retreating further and further back towards Berlin. I've seen those pamphlets. And with a little son pride, they were smoking. They just told the Nazis they didn't have a chance. In contrast, the material their military dropped on our soldiers was written in mangled English, comical stuff. And my dad has really been singled out. He's in the Holocaust Museum for his contributions to helping our army beat the Nazis. And after the war, he became a journalist and an author. My mom came in 1939, a few years after my dad. During the war, she served in the Women's Army Corps. She was in England and France and Germany. And on the wall at home is a picture of my mom in her WAC uniform. You can look at that picture and you can see pride in serving our country from every single pore. After the war, my mom had a long career as a research librarian, and she worked even harder raising her oldest son, who mostly wanted to play NBA basketball instead of hitting the books. Both my parents felt so blessed that they could get out of Germany. They made it over the paper wall, Mr. President. They had a chance to become Americans. Most Jewish families in the United States, stories just like these, some were able to get out, others were left behind and lost. Many remember the MS St. Louis, a ship with nearly 1,000 refugees, mostly Jewish, fleeing Germany in 1930. Originally, they sailed for Cuba, but they were turned away when they reached Havana. Then they tried to come to America. They got so close they could see the lights shining in Miami, but again, they were turned away and sailed back to Europe. Hundreds of them, Mr. President, died in death camps. Many more lives like those aboard the St. Louis could and should have been saved, but the paper wall, that paper wall kept too many people out. In 2020, caring people look back and recognize that paper wall and our failure to save more people from execution at the hands of the Nazis was a staggering humanitarian disaster, a real stain on American history. Donald Trump and his advisors, on the other hand, must look back and see the paper wall as a big success, a playbook for their administration. Under Donald Trump, the policy of the United States on immigration, asylum, on refugees, sum it up in one word: cruelty. Trump's worst legacy on asylum and refugee policy, without a doubt, is the kidnapping and abuse of youngsters, children, locking them in cages, losing track of them, losing track of their parents. It's the forced sterilization of women in the custody of the U.S. government. It's violating U.S. law and international treaties to turn asylum seekers into criminals. I went to the border to see for myself what Trump's family separation policies look like in practice. When you see it, you never forget it. I met a migrant woman who was almost 9 months pregnant and suffering complications. A pediatrician from Oregon who came with me was concerned that this woman's life was in danger, as well as her unborn child. She'd been stopped at the border along with her husband and their 3-year-old son, even though she had a legal right to make an asylum claim. Our pediatrician, who worried that the woman was going to go into labor right there, had to make a judgment call about what we ought to do. So fortunately, we got her case before the right border authorities. She was able to make her asylum claim, get medical care, keep her family together. At the time, I saw a little boy who'd been detained for several nights in a cold, cramped cell. They call them ice boxes, then sent back to Mexico. This youngster was so traumatized at the border that he became entirely nonverbal and afraid of adults. His father held my hand. The child cried and told us how helpful they felt as a parent. I will never forget that experience. Children and parents on the southern border have experienced some of the worst of Donald Trump's hostility, but it doesn't end there. His administration has relentlessly attacked and squeezed the traditional systems of immigration, humanitarian assistance, and refugee resettlement as well. A lot has gone into this paper wall. Anti-immigration policies have bookended the Trump 4 years. One of their first new policies out of the gate was the Muslim ban, which was a nightmare for many immigrants and immigrant families. Now, in Donald Trump's final days, his administration has made the citizenship exam twice as hard and twice as long. Reportedly, questions were rewritten with Trump-friendly political bias and tricky language designed to trip people up. There wasn't any discussion about any exams here in Congress. When you read the old version of the test that existed before the Trump meddling, it was pretty darn challenging. There's no good faith explanation for the changes. It was only about making it harder to become an American. Through his years in office, Donald Trump steadily lowered the cap on refugees allowed in the country. For 2021, he set it at the lowest number ever. Then there's the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. We talked here in the Senate about the Dreamers. And when the program was created, there was a promise made that it would be okay for the Dreamers to come out of the shadows. You could apply without fear, have your application renewed in 2 years. I think the government has a moral obligation to keep the promise. Not on Donald Trump's watch. If not for court orders, DACA would be dismantled by now. There are more than 11,000 hardworking young people in my home state that are DACA recipients. I've talked with a lot of them. They come to my town hall meetings. We meet on campus, meet in coffee shops. Not long after the pandemic hit, one young Oregon DACA recipient started working with COVID patients. Just wanted to help during the pandemic, coordinating tests, working on follow-up, contact tracing. What a wonderful person doing essential work during the pandemic. But her temporary DACA status ran out just when the Trump administration blocked renewals. Fortunately, my staff and I were able to help her reapply, retain her status, so she could keep working in the only place she ever called home.